Andrew Bishop of Signum, who's been writing amazing notes, who I've been following every single day. Andrew, thank you so much for being with us. I want to start with your expectation. Will the U.S. get involved or not? And what exactly is going to tip the difference in that decision?
Yeah, hi, Lisa. So our expectation at Signum is that the U.S. will not get involved. We have about a 35% chance or so that the U.S. does get involved directly. But the reason for that is not that we think the president is, bluffing or going to chicken out. None of that. Clearly, the U.S. military defense posture is one of preparations for a real attack. There's no question. He's serious about this. The reason we don't think it's likely in terms of above 50% is if you compound the odds that Iran agrees to a deal, right? So basically, Iran fully agrees to relinquish its nuclear program, plus the odds that the Israelis are able to achieve what they want to achieve at Fordow, which is Iran's sort of last hardened nuclear site. You compound those two odds, you get to, 70% chance or so that the U.S. doesn't, quote unquote, need to intervene. And as you just mentioned right before, I don't think President Trump is sort of chomping at the bit to get involved in this war. I think he will if he has to, but only if he has to.
Meanwhile, we're hearing from the energy minister of Israel earlier this morning that Israel plans to complete the Iran task, whether or not the U.S. joins. There's a feeling we've heard from Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, who's come out and said that we can accomplish our goals with or without the United States. What does that look like in real terms, and how disruptive could that be, whether or not the U.S. decides to get involved?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's sort of an opportunity to sort of recap the three scenarios, right? In our view, this is going to end with Iran basically without a nuclear program. And there are three ways you can get there. Either the US does it, Israel does it, or the Iranians agree to do it voluntarily. Our base case is that, as you just hinted at, Israel is essentially going to destroy Fordow on their own. We've long said that we thought they had the capability to attack Iran on their own at a time when no one else was saying that. That has now happened. We think they're going to finish the job successfully on their own. In parallel to that, we're going to have negotiations. And once Fordow is destroyed, I think we're going to get an agreement with the Iranians to essentially put this past us. The reason I think we're going to get an agreement, and Israel will also stop its attack eventually, and by eventually I mean about 10 days from now, is essentially because the Israelis, just as much as the Americans, understand that you actually need an agreement in place for the after war, right? You're going to need to be able to monitor what's going on in Iran. You can't just bomb it for the next 5 years straight.
Andrew, it's Brian Levitt here. What do you think the after war looks like? We talk about the potential. You talk about Israel perhaps being able to accomplish what they're seeking to accomplish, but what does that after war period then look like?
Yeah, so from a military perspective, the two goals are basically no more ballistic missiles. So no ability to produce them, not much by way of stockpile, no way of launching them. That's what the Israelis are working on right now, is mainly the launchers. Iran has, people always talk about how many missiles Iran has. What really matters is how many sort of launchers they have, right? And that's what Israel is really focused on. Second, and most obvious, is the nuclear program. Just no nuclear program, no enrichment, no weaponization program. And then the third thing, which I think you may or may not be hinting at, is this question of regime change. We think regime change in the sense of someone of a completely different ilk taking over is very unlikely. What's more likely is that Khamenei himself actually loses power and is replaced by someone else, perhaps from the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards. To us, that's not regime change, that's leadership change. But interestingly, and I'll stop here, people are very focused on the odds of that happening during the war. So this, 3-week period, let's say. Political science precedent shows that the most likely time for Khamenei to actually lose power is after the war ends, when people really have the time to get upset.
Does that give you the sense then that this conflict perhaps becomes colder in the short term, but just continues to persist over the number of years?
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment. Israel has long had this approach of sort of what they call mowing the lawn, right? So you conduct attacks, you wipe out your enemy's capabilities. When they grow back, you come back in. That's what an Iran deal would ideally avoid. But, the word ideally is doing heavy lifting here.
Andrew, there's also the issue of how much this can continue to disrupt oil output from Iran and potentially shipping from the rest of the world. Does this take the idea of blocking the Strait of Hormuz somehow off the table, based on the fact that what you just laid out didn't really leave a lot of room for that potential?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a few things on Iran's ability to sort of disrupt the Strait of Hormuz. First thing is, just to be clear, we don't think it's likely. We think Iran is unlikely to do it because it would put a target on its own oil infrastructure's back, right? There would be a high risk that Israel and or the US would attack Iran's oil infrastructure to sort of punish it for disrupting Hormuz. Second, more importantly, Iran doesn't have the ability to destroy Hormuz. It would be difficult for Iran to do in quote unquote peacetime as hybrid, a hybrid warfare tactic. It's going to be very difficult / impossible for Iran to do right now with all Israeli and American eyes on its sort of mining and naval capabilities. Third thing I would say, though, is the big risk to oil, in our view, actually comes from Israel attacking Iran's oil infrastructure, not from Iran disrupting the Gulf infrastructure. And that's not because I'm picking on Israel. It's just because if you're Israel, this is your once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to essentially wipe out the revenue source for the Iranian regime. Now, again, that's not a base case, but it's the risk we're keeping an eye on.
And maybe the reason why Iran is trying to ship as much oil as they can off their shores right now to try to maximize on that. Andrew Bishop of Signum, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll get to speak with you.